June 20th, 1940. A heavy fog clings to the streets of London. The city is scarred by weeks of relentless bombing. Church bells toll intermittently, signalling another night of air raids. Inside a dimly lit cabinet room, Winston Churchill stands over a map marked with advancing German divisions, their lines stretching across France like dark veins. Outside, the muffled roar of aircraft engines cuts through the night, a reminder of Britain's vulnerability. Meanwhile, in Berlin, the German High Command convenes in a cold, cavernous bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. Hitler, rigid and pale, leans over his own maps, tracing the path from the Channel to the Thames. Around him, generals argue in clipped tones. The Luftwaffe's successes in France have left the German leadership confident yet cautious. A document rests on the table marked Final Peace Offer to Britain. The words are simple, but the implications immense. One signature could alter the fate of Europe, ending the war or prolonging it indefinitely. The tension is silent yet palpable. Every movement, every glance carries weight. The world teeters between capitulation and defiance. And in London, Churchill reads the German proposal, his face unreadable, the air thick with history about to be made. This moment, poised between negotiation and war, will define the resolve of nations. By mid-1940, the European continent had been transformed by the rapid advance of German forces. In May, the Wehrmacht executed the Blitzkrieg across the Low Countries and France, overwhelming fortifications and maneuvering around defensive lines with unprecedented speed. Paris fell on June 14, leaving France in disarray. The French government fled to Bordeaux, and an armistice was negotiated under the shadow of German occupation. Europe's balance of power had shifted dramatically in a matter of weeks. Britain, once allied closely with France, now stood largely alone against the Axis. The British Isles, geographically insulated yet militarily exposed, faced the looming threat of invasion. Operation Sea Lion, Hitler's plan to cross the Channel, remained under preparation. The Royal Air Force had achieved initial defensive success during the Battle of France, but losses were significant and resources were stretched thin. Intelligence reports indicated the Luftwaffe's confidence and scale. Radar stations along the coast tracked continuous German reconnaissance flights. Civilians and soldiers alike faced the psychological weight of impending conflict, and London's government operated under constant alert, with blackout measures and air raid shelters becoming standard. Politically, the situation was precarious. Neville Chamberlain had resigned, and Winston Churchill assumed the office of Prime Minister on May 10, 1940. Churchill inherited not just a government but a nation under siege, forced to project confidence while preparing for the worst. The British cabinet was a mixture of experienced ministers and reluctant policymakers, many sceptical of prolonged resistance but united in preventing surrender. Churchill, understanding both the strategic and symbolic importance of Britain's stance, began consolidating military and political strategy, emphasizing morale as a weapon alongside tanks and aircraft. Meanwhile, Germany's strategic posture was one of both triumph and calculation. Hitler, emboldened by the fall of France, perceived Britain as the remaining obstacle to continental dominance. German leadership debated the merits of immediate aggression versus inducement. Some generals urged a decisive strike across the Channel, while others favored negotiation, recognizing that forcing Britain into submission could be more politically advantageous than risking costly amphibious operations. Within the Reich Chancellery, these debates carried a weight beyond military calculation. The optics of European capitulation could strengthen Hitler's position both domestically and internationally. At the core of these deliberations was the Final Peace Offer, a document intended to test Britain's limits. It proposed terms that, while harsh, left room for sovereignty under German oversight. Historians note that Hitler sought not just victory but legitimacy, aiming to co-opt Britain into a European order under the Reich. The offer was precise: military concessions, colonial negotiations, trade agreements, and recognition of German dominance in continental Europe. Any refusal, however, would signal to the German High Command that further coercion or invasion was necessary. This period, defined by rapid territorial shifts and the collapse of traditional alliances, forced leaders on both sides into high-stakes calculations. Churchill faced the challenge of interpreting German intentions while maintaining national resolve. His understanding of Hitler's psychology, forged through years of observation and intelligence briefings, informed the decisions he would make over the following days. Britain's survival depended on the ability to balance military preparedness with political audacity, to resist offers that could undermine independence while preparing for the possibility of a full-scale war on home soil. As Europe reeled from the shock of France's surrender, the eyes of the world turned to Britain. The German High Command, confident yet cautious, awaited a response that would determine whether their next actions would be diplomatic or martial. The stage was set, the pieces in motion, and the moment of choice was imminent, a choice that would define not only a nation but the course of history. The weeks following France's surrender were marked by an uneasy calm, a tense pause in the whirlwind of Europe's collapse. London remained vigilant, yet behind closed doors, the British leadership assessed its position with meticulous precision. Churchill convened meetings with military chiefs, intelligence officers, and foreign diplomats, piecing together the extent of Germany's ambitions. Reports from France painted a stark picture. German units were consolidating control, establishing supply lines, and preparing for further operations, while collaborationist governments were installed to stabilize occupied territories. The speed of German victories weighed heavily on British strategic planning. The German High Command, meanwhile, believed that Britain's morale was fractured. Hitler's advisors argued that the war-weary population, coupled with the threat of aerial bombardment, could pressure the government into negotiating peace. The proposed terms were designed to exploit these pressures: recognition of German dominance in Europe, partial demilitarization, and economic concessions that would integrate Britain into a German-dominated system, without direct annexation. Hitler's correspondence to his generals indicated a preference for British acquiescence, presenting a facade of magnanimity while retaining the capacity for coercion. German leaders debated the tone of the message too harsh, and Britain might stiffen its resistance too lenient, and the opportunity to secure strategic advantage might be lost. Intelligence played a crucial role. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park intercepted communications detailing German assumptions about British intentions. Analysts concluded that Hitler expected Churchill, whom he underestimated, to seek negotiation or even partial surrender. This miscalculation would shape subsequent events. Churchill's awareness of the German perception of weakness informed his strategic posture. He chose not merely to reject the offer, but to present Britain as resolute, signaling that surrender was inconceivable. The Prime Minister's rhetoric, precise and unyielding, reinforced both domestic morale and international credibility. On the German side, internal divisions became more pronounced. Field Marshal Keitel and General Jodl advocated for caution, noting the logistical challenges of a Channel invasion and the potential for protracted engagement. Conversely, generals like Guderian and Rommel argued for swift, decisive military action, believing that Britain's isolated position made capitulation inevitable if pressure continued. Hitler's personal involvement in the discussions added tension. His temperament oscillated between calm calculation and fiery insistence, creating an environment where every decision carried both strategic and psychological weight. The final peace offer was not merely a document. It was an instrument of influence, intended to resolve the British question without further bloodshed, but backed implicitly by the threat of overwhelming force. Meanwhile, the broader world watched with uncertainty. The United States remained neutral but observant, tracking Europe's military developments and Britain's responses. The Soviet Union, having signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Germany in 1939, calculated its own position, weighing the potential for German focus to shift westward. Colonial empires, particularly in Africa and Asia, braced for the possible extension of the conflict, understanding that Britain's stance would directly affect global strategic alignments. Amid this geopolitical calculus, ordinary citizens in Britain faced the psychological burden of an anticipated invasion. Air raid drills, rationing, and propaganda campaigns reinforced the message of resilience. Civilians knew the stakes. The nation's survival depended not only on military readiness, but on collective endurance. Churchill, acutely aware of this, leveraged public addresses and speeches to fortify resolve, framing the choice as a moral imperative as well as a strategic necessity. By late June 1940, all elements converged toward a decisive moment. Germany had presented its proposal, a carefully constructed test of Britain's willingness to submit. Churchill's cabinet debated quietly, weighing military feasibility against the moral and political consequences of acceptance or refusal. The High Command in Berlin, confident but calculating, awaited the response, unaware that Britain's leader would interpret the offer not as a path to peace, but as an opportunity to assert defiance. The stage was set for confrontation, not on the battlefield, but within the minds of leaders. Diplomacy, psychology, and strategy intersected, creating a tension that would define the war's trajectory. In a few days, Britain's decision would reverberate across Europe, forcing Germany to confront the limits of its power and shaping the narrative of resistance that would endure through the coming years. The next step would test leadership, resolve, and the capacity of a nation to endure under existential threat. Winston Churchill, newly appointed Prime Minister, carried the weight of Britain's survival on his shoulders. Every gesture in the cabinet room conveyed purpose. His eyes scanned reports, absorbing troop movements, Luftwaffe sorties, and intelligence intercepts. He understood the German calculations. Hitler believed Britain might bend, that morale could fracture under bombardment and isolation. Churchill refused to concede that possibility. For him, refusal was not rhetoric, it was a strategic weapon. He recognized the psychological dimension of leadership. A nation's courage hinged on the perception of its leader's certainty. Churchill's human capacity to maintain composure, even as the continent fell, became a decisive element in Britain's posture. The military reality shaped every political decision. The Royal Navy controlled the Channel, limiting German options for immediate invasion. Britain's air defences, though depleted, remained operational, radar networks providing early warnings of incoming raids. Intelligence assessments highlighted the difficulty of a seaborne assault. German plans for Operation Sea Lion required unprecedented coordination between Luftwaffe, Kriegsmarine, and ground forces. Delays, miscalculations, or resistance could prove catastrophic. The final peace offer was partly tactical, an attempt to secure compliance without risking the high cost of invasion. Churchill's military advisors presented realistic projections of casualties and operational failure probabilities, reinforcing the necessity of refusing negotiations that could compromise long-term defense. The war's technological context influenced the stakes. Britain's radar network, the Chain-Home system, provided critical early warning capability, offsetting numerical disadvantages in aircraft. The Luftwaffe relied on tactical bombing precision, yet limitations in navigation and coordination created vulnerabilities. German armoured divisions excelled on continental terrain but faced logistical constraints crossing the Channel. Supply lines, fuel storage, and troop deployment were all finite, creating friction in German planning. The final peace offer assumed British incapacity, but technological realities made total submission uncertain. Both sides understood that warfare was not only about numbers but about the integration of intelligence, logistics, and industrial capacity. Hitler's personality shaped the offer itself. His insistence on a final peace proposal reflected a dual strategy, testing Britain's resolve while projecting the appearance of reason. Within the High Command, debates were heated. Some generals urged immediate military action. Others warned that misjudging Britain could result in protracted conflict. Hitler leveraged both fear and persuasion, using the document as a psychological tool. The precise wording, coupled with subtle threats, was meant to manipulate perceptions of inevitability. Leadership at this level was a psychological duel, one nation asserting moral and political authority, the other attempting to coerce compliance through intimidation backed by military might. The German High Command assumed Britain's military and civilian morale were fragile. Reports from occupied France, diplomatic channels, and intelligence briefings suggested that pressure could yield concessions. Hitler and his advisors envisioned a European order in which Britain would accept limited sovereignty while recognizing German dominance. Their calculations were precise but flawed. They underestimated Churchill's understanding of national psychology and Britain's capacity for sustained resistance. The misreading of the enemy's resolve became a crucial factor, illustrating that strategic planning depended as much on perception as on resources or firepower. These angles, human, tactical, technological, leadership, and enemy perception, intersected in June 1940, shaping the moment of decision. Churchill's refusal was not merely political posturing. It was informed by military analysis, technological realities, and an understanding of German psychology. The final peace offer became a test, a lens through which the strengths and limitations of both nations were revealed. The implications of these angles converged, preparing the ground for the decisive moment when the offer would be formally rejected, triggering strategic and psychological consequences across Europe. Churchill's refusal carried profound moral weight. Accepting the German offer would have spared immediate suffering, air raids, potential invasion, but at the cost of sovereignty and moral authority. For Britain, the war was no longer only about territory, it was about principles. The choice crystallized the ethical dimension of leadership, whether to preserve life under imposed subjugation or to defend autonomy despite imminent danger. Public perception mattered. The Prime Minister's decision would set a precedent, signaling to both citizens and the world that Britain valued principle alongside survival. In historical context, moral calculation intertwined with strategy, transforming the peace offer into an ethical as well as political challenge. The psychological battlefield was as crucial as the physical one. Churchill's speeches, carefully crafted, reinforced the notion that Britain would not yield. Propaganda campaigns emphasized courage, endurance, and duty. Leaflets and radio broadcasts highlighted German atrocities in France, warning of consequences should surrender occur. Civilian participation, rationing, air raid drills, volunteer services created a collective sense of purpose. The final peace offer tested this resolve, revealing the interplay between leadership, morale, and national psychology. Germany assumed fear, Britain demonstrated determination. The psychological calculus amplified the stakes, making perception an instrument of survival. Britain's refusal reverberated beyond its borders. A German-aligned Britain would have freed resources for campaigns elsewhere, Africa, the Middle East, and potentially against the Soviet Union. Churchill's stance forced Germany to commit further to military options rather than political subjugation. Allies in waiting, particularly the United States and the Commonwealth, observed the decision closely. Britain's resistance signaled that Axis domination would not be uncontested, influencing global strategic calculations. The final peace offer thus operated as both a tactical maneuver and a test of international signaling. Acceptance would have reshaped alliances, refusal preserved leverage and credibility. The German proposal contained economic stipulations, trade concessions, resource access, and integration into a German-dominated economic sphere. Acceptance would have undercut Britain's industrial independence, directing critical raw materials and production toward Axis priorities. Conversely, refusal maintained industrial autonomy, crucial for sustaining military operations and supporting allies. Britain's ability to mobilize economic resources, maintain shipping routes, and continue armament production was central to the decision. The peace offer's economic dimension highlighted the long-term consequences of capitulation, short-term survival versus strategic sustainability. Finally, the offer was a historical pivot point. Britain's response would enter the narrative of the war, framing national identity and leadership for decades. Acceptance might have rewritten Europe's story, German hegemony, diminished British influence, and altered post-war boundaries. Refusal, by contrast, reinforced a narrative of resistance, defining Churchill's legacy and Britain's role in preserving a free Europe. Historians note that the decision crystallized the psychological and symbolic dimensions of the war, establishing Britain as a moral and strategic counterpoint to Axis ambitions. These additional angles, moral, psychological, strategic, economic, and historical, interacted with those previously analyzed. The decision to reject the final peace offer was multidimensional. It combined ethics, perception, strategy, and foresight. Each aspect influenced the other, shaping not just immediate responses, but the trajectory of the entire conflict. The convergence of these perspectives set the stage for the climax, turning point, when the refusal would trigger immediate operational and psychological consequences within the German High Command, transforming strategy and expectation across Europe. The moment of decision arrived in late June 1940. Churchill, surrounded by his cabinet in the dimly lit war room of 10 Downing Street, reviewed the German final peace offer once more. The document was precise, almost clinical in tone, recognition of German dominance in continental Europe, demilitarization clauses, trade concessions and conditional sovereignty. No overt threat of invasion appeared in writing, but the weight of German victories loomed over every clause. Vision reinforced national cohesion. Churchill's addresses framed the refusal not as obstinacy, but as a moral and strategic necessity. The public absorbed the message, responding with heightened vigilance. Air raid drills intensified, anti-invasion defenses along southern coastlines were reinforced, volunteer enlistment surged. Intelligence operations, including code-breaking efforts at Bletchley Park, gained strategic importance. Britain's refusal transformed morale into a tactical asset, bolstering civilian and military capacity simultaneously. International observers reacted cautiously. The United States noted Britain's firmness, interpreting it as a sign of credibility and endurance. This perception would influence later material support, including the Lend-Lease programs that became pivotal in sustaining British military operations. Across the Commonwealth, the refusal galvanized colonial contributions, from troop deployments to industrial production, reinforcing the global dimension of Britain's stand. The rejection demonstrated that leadership, perception, and communication could amplify military capability, shaping strategic outcomes beyond immediate battlefield engagements. Germany responded methodically but with growing urgency. Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain, faced new scrutiny. Naval and air components were assessed against British defensive readiness, with tidal patterns, fleet availability, and radar coverage under continuous review. The refusal forced Germany to confront operational constraints that had been largely abstract during the rapid continental advance. What had once appeared to be a straightforward path to European dominance now became a complex strategic challenge, with risk amplified by the need to neutralize an unyielding opponent. Within the broader European context, the refusal altered Axis assumptions about rapid conquest. Hitler's ambitions, previously reliant on swift victories and capitulation, encountered the reality of protracted resistance. Military planners recalibrated timelines and expectations, recognizing that forcing Britain into submission would require sustained pressure rather than a singular, decisive act. The shift marked a turning point in the strategic narrative. Britain's defiance demonstrated that psychological and moral factors could impose operational limits on even the most dominant military power. Civilian impact in Britain was tangible. Cities enacted blackout protocols, transportation networks adjusted for potential attacks, and rationing systems were strengthened. Public consciousness centered on resilience, creating a collective identity tied to national survival. The refusal thus extended beyond policy. It became embedded in the social and cultural fabric of wartime Britain, shaping perceptions, behavior, and expectations. Churchill's leadership during this period emphasized the interdependence of strategy, morale, and perception. The refusal was not an isolated act, but a deliberate integration of military intelligence, political calculation, and psychological fortitude. By rejecting the final peace offer, Britain imposed constraints on Germany's strategic options, while consolidating its own capacity to endure and respond. The decision set the conditions for the next phase of the war, influencing operational planning, civilian preparedness, and international relations alike. As weeks progressed, the long-term consequences of Britain's refusal became increasingly evident. In Berlin, frustration mingled with calculation. The Wehrmacht's earlier confidence, forged in rapid continental victories, gave way to recognition of the limits imposed by geography, weather, and resilient opposition. Hitler ordered the Luftwaffe to intensify reconnaissance and bombing campaigns over southern England, testing defenses and seeking to degrade morale. The strategic emphasis shifted from diplomacy to attrition, highlighting the operational and psychological consequences of Britain's refusal. Britain's domestic situation, conversely, strengthened. Civilian compliance with air raid precautions, rationing, and volunteer efforts became institutionalized, while the Home Guard expanded its presence along potential invasion routes. Industrial output, particularly in armaments, continued to grow, bolstered by the belief that surrender was not an option. Code-breaking and intelligence networks, including the work at Bletchley Park, provided critical early warnings, enabling proactive defense planning. The refusal had transformed perception into action, creating tangible military and societal advantages. Internationally, the message was clear: Britain would resist. The United States observed with increased strategic interest, recognizing that supporting Britain could preserve a counterbalance to Axis expansion. Commonwealth nations, including Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, reaffirmed commitments to Britain's defense. Across occupied Europe, the refusal resonated symbolically, offering a template of defiance against Axis dominance. Germany's inability to secure compliance without force demonstrated the limits of intimidation, altering both diplomatic expectations and operational calculations. Operational planning within Germany became more urgent and complex. The Luftwaffe's focus shifted to air superiority missions, attempting to weaken Britain's defences before any potential amphibious operations. Naval logistics faced scrutiny. Sufficient troop transports, escort vessels, and supply chains were critical, yet vulnerable to British interception. Hitler's generals debated timing, feasibility, and risk, aware that prolonged campaigns could strain resources already committed elsewhere in Europe. The refusal forced Germany to expend energy on preparation and contingency planning rather than immediate conquest, slowing momentum that had previously been near unstoppable. The social and psychological impact in Britain was profound. Public speeches, radio broadcasts, and propaganda campaigns reinforced the narrative of national resilience. Citizens internalized a sense of shared purpose, linking moral resolve with practical preparedness. The refusal was not merely symbolic. It generated collective action, from civil defense to industrial mobilization, amplifying Britain's capacity to resist through coordination and morale. Historians note that this period laid the foundation for sustained endurance during the Battle of Britain, providing both operational and psychological advantages that proved decisive in the months to come. By the end of summer 1940, the refusal had solidified Britain's position strategically, morally, and symbolically. Germany, constrained by operational challenges and the unyielding opponent across the Channel, adjusted its planning for a protracted engagement. Britain, unified and resolute, transformed the act of rejection into a strategic lever, demonstrating the interplay of leadership, morale, and national capacity. The consequences extended beyond the immediate months. The refusal became a defining pivot, shaping the trajectory of the war, influencing Allied perceptions, and establishing Britain as the first major counterweight to Axis expansion. The convergence of these factors, the operational recalibration in Germany, the domestic consolidation in Britain, and the international perception of resolve, created a lasting effect on the course of World War II. From the initial refusal emerged a framework for sustained resistance, one that would dictate military planning, civilian behavior, and global strategy. This moment, forged in June 1940, marked a decisive turning point, linking moral courage with practical outcomes and altering the war's trajectory for years to follow. The refusal of Germany's final peace offer in June 1940 stands as a defining moment in the history of World War II. It was a choice that transcended immediate tactical considerations, intertwining moral resolve, strategic calculation, and national identity. Churchill's decision crystallized the principle that survival required more than weapons and territory. It demanded courage, foresight, and an unwavering sense of purpose. Britain's response demonstrated that leadership could shape not only policy, but the collective consciousness of a nation. The consequences extended far beyond London or the English Channel. Germany's assumption of inevitability was shattered, forcing the High Command to confront the complexities of prolonged engagement. Operation Sea Lion, once a theoretical blueprint for conquest, became a logistical and psychological challenge of unprecedented scale. Germany's momentum in Europe, built on rapid victories and capitulation, encountered the first serious barrier, a nation unwilling to yield. At the human level, the refusal reinforced morale across both civilian and military populations. Citizens internalized responsibility for survival, soldiers prepared with renewed purpose, and leadership projected steadfastness. Internationally, the act signaled to allies and neutrals alike that resistance remained viable. It set a precedent, shaping diplomatic calculations, influencing material support, and preserving the strategic balance that would later enable coordinated Allied efforts. Historically, the moment illustrates the interplay between psychology, strategy, and ethics. It reveals that decisions of principle can carry practical weight, influencing outcomes as decisively as battlefield maneuvers. Britain's rejection of the offer became a symbol of defiance, a pivot upon which the trajectory of war, and ultimately the preservation of Western Europe, rested. In the larger arc of history, the refusal underscores a fundamental truth. The survival of nations depends not solely on military capacity, but on the clarity of vision, the resolve of leadership, and the willingness of societies to endure under existential threat. The final peace offer was more than a document, it was a test of character. Britain's answer echoed across decades, shaping not only the outcome of World War II, but the enduring narrative of courage, resilience, and the strategic power of unyielding principle.